So we're going to talk about production, urban production. So what are the impacts of maybe new technologies of making things, again, producing and consuming, or producing and getting rid of something. The kind of urban metabolism is what the last two sessions are going to be dealing with. So tomorrow we'll talk about waste, recycling, and things like that. So that's again one human function that we are using to discuss the contemporary city, or the city as of the near future, as we like to call it. And so today we will deal with production, with generating things, constructing things as a collective endeavor in cities. And we're going to look at it in different ways. As any of these sessions, it's a little bit disorganized, so I just find maybe related processes or related examples that I believe are indexes of potentially wider concerns. And in the case of urban production, you will see that there are many things that I brought in. Production is obviously something, an activity, one of these externalized activities that has to do with, more directly, with economy, which is a kind of, again, a human concern of the management of resources, etc., etc. But on one side, it is a very economic-driven and politically driven concern. So there is a lot of politics involved in how cities structure the forms of production. But I also like in this session to bring into the question the concerns about making the city. So the city in itself is a product, is an artifact, is a human construction, not a natural construction. And so there are two sides to this discussion. One is, how do we make cities, and what are the processes that are involved in the production of the city itself as an artifact. And then there are issues about how productive sectors of the economy are embedded into the urban fabric, and what are the impacts of these processes in the planning of the cities. The planning, I mean, there is one part of the presentation today that is very much about planning, or about the relationship between design and construction. So when we design, we envision something, we imagine something, and we conceive the process by which something is built. And that happens when we make a piece of furniture, or a piece of cloth, or food, or a piece of the city. So the idea of to what degree do we plan or we don't, and to what degree does the design and the production come together, and in what sequence do they come together, will be also a concern of this. So I'm going to start from a very economic driven concern that I think is very much related to the production of the city itself. So we will start with the city as an artifact, with the city as a product, and then we'll talk back and forth of the integration of industry into the city. Those are the main concerns. So you may have heard about Thomas Piketty and this book, The Capital in the 21st Century. It's been like a kind of bestseller in the economy. I can't remember now when this was published, maybe 2015 or something like that. Maybe earlier than 2018, I think, maybe 2016, 2015. And so Thomas Piketty is a French economy, a kind of left-wing French economist who came up with the theory that what has happened since the 70s in the world economy, in a kind of sort of global economy, is that there has been a decoupling between the reddits of labor and the reddits of capital, which means that capital, the people that have capital make much more money, increasingly more money than the people who are getting paid for the work they do. And so he says that this is a kind of, this is a problem that cannot be resolved and that prevents from people benefiting from their work. So what happens is that somebody who has capital keeps making money and doesn't increasingly doesn't need people in order to keep making money, while people who are selling their labor, which is most of us, have an increasingly limited capacity to profit from our work, and so the whole dynamic of capital and labor, which is a kind of classical definition in kind of Marxist theory, etc., is destabilized. And that is even more destabilized with the emergence of automation, the emergence now of artificial intelligence. So these technologies are increasing the advantages of capital versus labor. So if somebody who has money can buy robots, can get rid of people who could or would be necessary in another form of economy, and artificial intelligence, people say that is going to get rid of a lot of work. So Piketty says that the only way to so that produces increases inequality and social stress, and people start complaining and so on and so forth. So Piketty in the mid 2010 came up with this theory that makes a number of analyses and comes up with the theory that the only way to deal with this increasing demeaning of labor versus capital is to tax. So it's to redistribute wealth systematically. So I mean, obviously he's a left winger, so he is in favor of taxing capital and redistributing wealth, so that laborers or people who work and who make their living out of doing work can progressively match the reddits of the people who own capital, who have capital. And so what is interesting about, which, I mean, you may or may not believe this, and there are all kinds of economies depending on your political inclinations, and I believe in neutrality in the university, so I won't tell you what is my creed, but I think it's a problem maybe for you to think about it. So this is what happens, the real labor income index and the rents, the kind of, to rent a house. I mean, this is something that you have suffered in Seoul, particularly in the last few years, but it has happened everywhere. Now in Seoul it has become extreme. But but the fact is that salaries are growing a much lower rate than rents. And so that's why he says the only way to do is to control the amount of money that people are making, people who own capital, urban capital, for example, real estate, can make. And the other interesting thing about this scenario is that what we have lived through probably since the 90s is what is called the financialization of the urban. So cities are not just places where people live and consume and produce and so on and so forth, but cities in themselves and these kind of artifacts. We're talking about the city as an artifact. Cities are also or have become to a large extent a business. So the real estate business that has existed maybe for a long time has become increasingly productive in the last few decades, because the real estate market, which existed in different forms earlier on, has become financialized. So there are some financial vehicles that are called rates. I don't know whether you have ever heard about this term. It's an acronym for real estate investment trust, which means that there are people who own property, and they basically own a lot of property, and they make it into a trust and invest it in the stock market. So the stock market usually dealt with commodities, with industrial production, with products that you sell. And what rates did, and rates are, I think, started in the 80s as a kind of legal entity. As you can see, the Reddits of real estate are much bigger even than the Reddits of the stock market. So the S&P index, the Standard & Poor index, which, as you may know, measures the growth or the increases of the financial growth in the stock market of different types of companies, Starbucks, IBM, whatever, they are collected as in the Standard & Poor index. The Standard & Poor 500 in particular in this graph are 500 companies that are selected, and that somehow by looking at how they evolve, you can see basically what is the state of the global economy. And as you can see, compared to the rates of growth of other companies, real estate industrial investment trusts have grown much more in the between the 90s and now. There have been a huge increase of the growth of that industry, and that makes even more interesting the case of the city as an artifact that has increased its value enormously. So what this means is that basically cities are a financial engine that is even more powerful than the production of goods in most cases. And there is so Piketty came up with this idea, and there was a young economist who actually maybe was a student of Piketty, called Matthew Rongley, which was, when this happens, was like 26 or something like that. It was a very young PhD or PhD candidate, or he didn't even have his PhD yet. At Rongley said that Piketty was wrong. And it was wrong precisely because there are because of the urban investment. So he stated that by using social housing policies, for example, you can control the inequities that are increasingly produced between the labor benefits and the capital reddits. So he said the key issue there is that there are people, or like the wealth of people today, at least in advanced societies, is primarily based on real estate. And that, I don't know how it happens here. I think it happens also here, but it happens in the States, it happens in Europe, that most of the money that you make in your life, you make it because you purchased a property when you were young and you kind of were struggling, and then you bought the property, and 10 years later is 3 times the same price. So you've made a lot of money out of investing in real estate. So what wrongly said is that you don't need necessarily to act on taxes in order to redistribute wealth, but if you act on urban production processes, you can narrow down that gap of inequality that has been produced by the growth of capital reddits versus labor costs. That's in a way what I believe sets up the current situation in most developed countries, and puts in a way the city as a central economic concern that not only affects architects or the life of people, but wealth inequality. So that I just wanted to kind of mention this because I think this is a very important background to understand where the industry that we are working on lies, at the very center of processes of redistribution of wealth. So the other thing so that has to do in some ways with the city as an artifact, with the city as something that we make and we developed and we trade and so on and so forth. The other side to these considerations of work or production in the city is what many theorists have been talking about for decades already, which is the evolution of technologies that have to do with production. So this is a very famous book from Jeremy Rifkin, who is a very interesting economist based in the US, who has become an advisor. I think he actually was quite strongly involved in Korea for a while, advising the government on industrial policies and things like that. But he's been in China, he's a kind of global theorist and consultant. And a few years ago he published this book where he stated that the fact that work had been automated by the emergence of computers, he said, we are living already in the third industrial revolution. So there was the first industrial revolution, and now we know that because there are robots. Rifkin also wrote another famous book, which is The End of Work. So for him, the idea that computers were involved in the economies, increasingly involved in the economies and the production of goods and services and so on, was potentially going to imply that the work was going to be reduced. He said this in the 90s. So back then already people were theorizing that computers were going to take away work from people. Same thing that is happening now with AI. but he was talking about it just when when work started to become automated by use of of computers. So it's interesting also to think about the end of work, which was it in 1995. He was saying that social and political protocols are going to have to be revised because a lot of people were going to be without work, and that the kind of leisure culture or leisure civilization would emerge. I don't know whether that actually happened or people even work harder. But I mean, that was his prediction about the third, what he called the third industrial revolution. So the kind of automation of work, or the emergence of later on of what is called the gig economy. And some people mention use the word precariat instead of proletariat, like the proletariat was where the proletarians who were working for a company for life, and had their social security, the social security paid by the company, and the retirement paid by the company, and so on and so forth. So what many people have been talking about is that the economy that we were starting to live in recently also was based on increasing instability of the job market, and so that instability of the job market, for example, had a very important impact on how factories are organized. So if you no longer need a factory in order to produce things because you can subcontract them, send the production to China or whatever. I mean, there are a number of other processes that have had obviously an important impact in urban economies, at least in the developed world, that had to do with the job regulations, the job market regulations. Klaus, so after Rifkin in 1995, or no, not 1995, this was earlier than 1995. I can't remember when the third industrial revolution was published, but was before the end of work. And he talked about the third industrial revolution. Klaus Schwab, who I don't know whether you know who this guy is the guy who set up the Davos conference. He's a wealthy Swiss industrialist with intellectual ambitions, and some people think that he's evil, and but he actually is somebody who, I don't know, evil or not, he's somebody who has been thinking, he's an economist, and has been thinking long and hard about the way in which economic processes operate today, and set up the Davos conference in order to open that discussion. I think he's about retiring, but Schwab also said, made one step further, which is that he said that now we are entering the fourth industrial revolution, and that is one step further from Rifkin's third industrial revolution, and includes what he calls cyber physical systems. Cyber physical systems are what we've been discussing in the last few sessions: Internet of Things, big data, augmented reality, cloud computing, artificial intelligence. So there are systems where the intelligence is already embedded in the physical. So in the third industrial revolution, that kind of merging between the physical and the computation didn't exist, but now pervasive computation, in the interpretation that Schwab makes out of this, is evolved, and he believes that this is an entirely new situation in which this label, the fourth industrial revolution, has been coined to describe the current trend of automation and data exchange in manufacturing technologies particularly. It includes cyber physical systems, the IoT and cloud computing and what has been called Industry 4.0, and it creates what he calls a smart factory. And in smart factories, cyber physical systems monitor the physical process of actually making things, producing things, creating a virtual copy of the physical world and making decentralized decisions. That is some of the things that Schwab talks about in this book. So industrial cyber physical systems communicate and cooperate with each other and with humans in real time. That's another reason why I believe that this scenario is part, and we've discussed it also in previous sessions, is part of what we can call a post-human urban environment. So, and then there are a number of people. Paul Mason wrote this book in 2017, which is called Post-Capitalism, and is talking about the sharing economy, which is part of this Internet of Things, as potentially the end of capitalism, or he says it's the end of private property. I mean, it's not, but I mean, you can agree with him or not, but the theory is that in the classical economies there is private property, and then you own an object or a property or an artifact or a piece of real estate, and you own it for life. But the emergence of these cyber physical systems imply that you can own something temporarily. So Airbnb, things that we've been talking about, WeWork, you don't rent things you don't own things, you use things for a short time, and things are shared. And obviously there is a kind of financial exchange behind, but the relationship between, or the property relationships are much more complex and unstable and temporary. So if you think about this, you go from the first industrial revolution, which is basically the introduction of mechanical production facilities with the help of energy, of power. Then the second industrial revolution, which has to do with the organization of work. So the work is split into different tasks, and different tasks are specialized, and so there are production chains that optimize the production of something. That's the second industrial revolution. The third industrial revolution is the integration of computers and IT systems and automated production. The fourth industrial revolution, following Schwab, is the connectivity between objects through cyber physical systems. That's basically where I'm kind of defining where we are now in terms of labor economies, because I think it's important to understand this, or to think about this picture when we are talking about the new work, the integration of work in cities today or in the near future. This is another economist, an older one, Nikolai Kondratiev, who, as opposed to maybe some of the other theorists, he makes this evolution, let's say, of a certain civilization based on technical innovation. So he identifies a number of inventions that are in his opinion crucial in in reorganizing the resources of a certain civilization, and he talks about the steam engine as the first, and the mechanization of cotton as the first set of, let's say, modern economic models. The second one is railway and steel. The third one is electricity. I mean, some of these things you probably can remember that some of these things have appeared in some of the historical background to the sessions. Chemistry, the synthesis of ammonia around the 1900, and the integration of electricity in cities as crucial moments in the evolution of urban structures. And then in the 1950s, automobiles, transportation, petrochemicals, the whole oil economy, and then in the 90s, the information technology, which will coincide with the third industrial revolution following Rifkin. And so Kondratiev was important because he was a Russian economist in the early 20th century whose ideas were developed by Schumpeter, who is an important economist again in the US. He was a professor at Harvard, and he is actually the professor of another character that we will see during the session, who is Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, the Viennese economic school. And so Kondratiev basically talks about these waves, and some people have been forecasting or trying to extend Kondratiev's technological waves as the main drivers of changes in civilizations and therefore in cities. And after the fifth wave, which is around the 1990s, which has to do with computation and pervasive computation and so on and so forth, they are saying that the sixth wave of technological innovation would revolve about many of the things that we've been discussing in the seminar, which is sustainability, resources, management of resources, productivity, design, biomimicry, green chemistry, industrial ecology. So that the people who have been trying to develop Kondratiev theories are pointing in that direction as the next stage of technological innovation after the computers. It will be almost as what we've been discussing in the earlier sessions, especially on urban ecology, the emergence of technologies that have to do with the reintegration of cities into nature. So what is interesting, and is already embedded in the critique of Piketty's capital in the 21st century, is that what we have experienced in the last decades is that the city in itself is the factory. The making of the city is the making of wealth, is the development processes. So most of the wealth is created because we create cities. That's why in the 1990s, when this paradigm settled or established itself, architects were heroes, and now we are the public enemy, because we consume resources, we pollute, we eliminate nature, and so that, I think that is why it's so important that we understand that this sixth wave of innovation, extending the Kondratiev thing, either we adjust the discipline to the sixth wave of innovation, or we are going to disappear. We are going to become the public enemy number one. And there is so that is on one side. So basically, what happened with major capitals in the developed world didn't happen in perhaps here, but is happening now, is that the industry moved out. I mean, like in London in the 90s, nobody wanted to get involved in industrial production. London was a city that was made by the Industrial Revolution, and in the 90s, people wanted to invest in real estate because real estate is where the growth was happening. Building the city, renting, trading with property, urban property was the main source of wealth of cities. Service economies and real estate. So from industrial production, cities went to making cities as the main productive activity in the city and the provision of services, but the whole industry disappeared. And there is one economist which I don't know whether you have heard of, who is Korean by origin, but has been living in England for a long time, Ha-Joon Chang, who for a while has been saying that this idea that cities can survive without industrial production is false. Like the city always is going to need some level of material production, and it cannot entirely rely on an economy of services and real estate, which is what basically urban economies became in the 90s. So what is interesting about the ideas that Ha-Joon Chang have been working on for a long time is that if you look now at for example, at the American political processes, and maybe these processes are basically prior to Biden's election, but every single politician is now, and I don't know how it is here. Europe is perhaps not so visible, but it is also visible. The politicians are talking about green economies, and the most interesting thing is that they are talking about industrial policy. So both Steve Bannon, who is the main political strategist behind Trump, or was the main political strategist behind Trump, and Elizabeth Warren, they are all talking about, the big American industry was sent to China, and now we are suffering, and there is a huge amount of people that are unemployed. I mean, like the cities are doing very well because they rely on an economy of services and real estate. But the rest of the country is sinking, and that is actually powering the electorate. I mean, the reason why Trump is again maybe going to become the American president, which is unbelievable, but maybe I'm not being neutral here, but but the fact that both the right and the left are starting to converge, that industrial policies are crucial. Now also the Americans are saying, well, semiconductors are produced in Korea and in China, and we invented them, but these people have taken over, and now we don't even have control on the industry, and they are investing heavily in rebuilding the capacity to produce semiconductors. So what we see now also is that there is a political interest in work, in industrial production, as opposed to the 90s, where industrial production nobody wanted to have anything to do with. It was done in China, and it was part of a global supply chain. Now developed economies are rethinking that it is impossible to entirely remove industrial work from city centers, and we need to kind of retrieve those activities back to the cities. And so, you know, the whole problematic that emerged already in the 70s, and the fact that there is increasing amounts of the population that are structurally jobless is one of the main concerns of these both right and left lobbies that are emerging in developed economies. So in this situation, I would like to go back a little bit into urbanism or architecture and urban design, and bring back something that appeared, I mean, like Aldo Rossi in the 80s started to talk again about the city as an artifact. The city as a manufatto in Italian means artifact. And so what was interesting about, so before Aldo Rossi is a kind of, let's say, a postmodernist. So after the modern period in which the city was designed almost exclusively by processes of planning, like urban planning, territorial planning, industrial planning. So there was a series of experts that were designing the city, not as an object itself, not as a physical entity, but as the manifestation of a series of economic and social and political processes. And Aldo Rossi is against that kind of modernist idea of the city as a machine, as a factory. He says no, it's not just a factory, it's a manufatto, it's an artifact. It's a thing that we produced and that has an internal structure that is physical and that needs to be considered when we design cities, and that obviously is it has a certain discipline. So he goes back to the discipline, and I think it's interesting to see Aldo Rossi emerges at the same time as operaism, which is some sort of extreme left wing discourse in Italy. Maybe one of the guys who were merged with operaism was just died a few days ago. Tony Negri. Have you heard about Tony Negri, the author of Empire? Was one of these. He was even, I think, at some point he had to move to France because he was a terrorist basically, and he was condemned and had to escape. But he was an intellectual, so he was teaching in universities and things like that. So against the people who were basically focusing architecture and urban design on political and social processes, Aldo Rossi said no, cities are also things, are physical structures, and there is a whole discipline of making cities as physical structures that we have to rely on, because eventually the physical qualities of cities will prevail over the political and economic processes. And this is something that in some ways has also been part of the discussions we've been having in the seminar, when we were talking the other day on whether the traditional city now is more capable to, I mean, we were talking about yesterday over the kind of intervention or integration. This battery is not working, so we need to plug it before it shuts down.
Is it charging now?
Now. Okay. So where was I? Yeah, we were talking about yesterday how the city predated the integration of urban traffic, and how it kind of adjusted to accommodate urban traffic, and how the urban fabric also changed with the integration of industrial production, and then not only industrial production but also the second industrial revolution and computation, and how computation made perhaps traditional urban structures more resilient. So there is a certain resilience of the city as an artifact, in the words of Aldo Rossi, that I think is interesting to think about it when we plan cities. So to what degree the planning of the city needs to rely on the technology of the day, or it needs to rely on the depth of space and the facade ratios and some sort of physical qualities that cities have, the width of the street or the urban canyon that ensure daylight and air exchange rates and things like that. So to what degree the city is a physical entity that performs very primitive tasks of bringing light and ventilation and allow movement, or the city is a machine. In the modernist city, the city is created in order to enable certain processes to take place. Why is this not moving? So if cities contain the whole complex of human activities, the city in themselves are also a manufacturer, an artifact, and therefore fabrication technologies may have also a profound effect on the design of cities and the development of urban ideology. So urban planning techniques have been traditionally affected by manufacturing and industrial planning. So the idea of making the city as an industrial production is very much part of the modern city in Le Corbusier and in other urban theorists. So the city is also become a product of the machine, of the industrial production. So in the after Second World War, in that industrial complexes, both in the USA and the Soviet Union, were actually extremely effective at generating industrial infrastructures for mass production. So the whole phenomenon of this American suburb, or the Khrushchevkas. Have you heard about the Khrushchevkas? It was this kind of Soviet-made precast concrete urban blocks, and that they were producing by thousands and thousands of these. So what is interesting in the post-war is that both in America and in the Soviet Union, the military industrial complex was reorganized in order to produce cities. So and they produce them systematically, perhaps not in the way in which Rossi was talking about the artifact, because for Rossi the artifact was loaded with meaning and history and so on and so forth. But those suburban constructions or blocks, and here is quite clear. No, in Seoul, the way in which these kind of concrete blocks have been slip-form construction has been optimized to an incredible level. Maybe more than anywhere else in the world. I keep telling my Korean friends that they should bid for projects for reconstructing Ukraine, because probably they have the best technology. Korea has the best technology to reconstruct the country in a record time. But so on one side we have the city as a product of industrial production, and on the other side we have the integration of production in the city. And I mean, this is one of my favorite areas in Seoul. I don't even know whether this exists anymore, but it's, as you know, El-Giro. And El-Giro is, I think, one of the world, I mean, I don't know, I know other places, and I will talk about them a little bit, but El-Giro is, it does have micro units of industrial production embedded in the city fabric, and is being demolished and is being replaced, and maybe that's inevitable because it's obviously not possible to have pieces of the city in these conditions, but at the same time, you know, you wonder. I mean, that would be maybe something for you to consider, and this is something that is very much related to phenomena that are happening in Seoul or were happening. I don't know how much of these things are left. These are all pictures that I got in different. So these are things that are happening in the city center, and they have to do with producing they producing not with large factories, by small units of of production that employ quite a lot of people, and more interestingly recycle a lot of stuff. So it's a type of industrial production that doesn't, on the contrary, they don't produce a lot of waste. They recycle a lot of things, and now, as you know, are being replaced by other forms of urban revenues. I mean, to what degree this can happen or not, I don't know. There are other similar cases. Akihabara I mean, it's a different situation entirely, because it's more like electronic markets, etc. In Tokyo, it's also like one of these. It's not industrial because it's basically commercial, but it emerged as a kind of from something similar to El-Giro, and then it became like a shopping mall for electronics. Or Shenzhen is another one of these cities that have had traditionally a very powerful small-scale inner city industrial production. This is a place called Huaqiangbei, who is an avenue in the center of Shenzhen that is similar to Akihabara, and where there used to be factories, but then eventually they evolve into some sort of market. So it's interesting to compare these things. This is Shenzhen, this is also Shenzhen, this is Huawei factories. So these are two different ways of integrating work in the structure of the city. Huawei is a kind of industrial park, is on the outskirts of the city, it's not part of the inner city. It doesn't mingle with other functions in the city, because it's like part of the modernist idea where activities in the city are segregated, as opposed to what was happening in El-Giro, Akihabara, Huaqiangbei, in different Asian cities, where these production facilities were happening together with residential in a kind of slightly brutal manner, but in a different economy. But the question is whether the future is this of this division of work and residential, or is actually a closer integration between both. This is another interesting example, is what is called the Taobao villages in China. Have you heard about this? So this is something that has been happening for maybe decades now, but at least in the last decade has become very, very powerful and very interesting, which has to do with the emergence of the internet, the Taobao. Taobao is one of the engines that it's like Amazon basically. So it's like a portal where you can buy and sell stuff by yourself. It's part of what we discuss in the communication sessions as a kind of peer-to-peer, the emergence of some sort of peer-to-peer structures that use connectivity as a way of exploiting or producing new economies. So the tower villages became phenomenally successful, and they were simply villages around main cities, but sometimes actually quite far away of Beijing or Shanghai, where villagers started to produce things and use use internet portals to sell them. So they were able to to cut the costs of industrial production by producing in villages where the property and the labor costs were very low and were mostly family-owned factories, micro factories. I mean, same things probably as you could find in El Giro not so long ago, but with a slightly more organized and larger scale. That villagers were so they would be in their village, they would produce, and they would produce in their own house. So they started these little factories in the home, and eventually they grew them. I mean, I've seen studies in which they take over the garden or the orchard of the house, and they build a shed and they increase the production, and then they go once or twice to Beijing or Shanghai to sell and to deliver the goods to the people who have bought them. And that created a real urban phenomenon. Like these villages suddenly flourished and became wealthy because they started profiting from the possibility of engaging with markets through new communication technologies and also some sort of decentralized micro units of production. So these are studies of and pictures of how these villages work. I mean, we're not going to talk about it. I just showed to you as an example of new forms of integration between industrial economy and the city with the advent of communication technologies and digital technologies. Now, these villages became so successful that the government, the Chinese government, who is very interested in decentralizing cities, is trying to limit the scale of Shanghai and Beijing and create satellite cities, decided that they were going to foster this movement of the Baidu, the Taobao villages. And so this is how the villages, I mean, the pictures that I just show is how the villages look like, or one of them look like. This is a master plan for that same village, made by the Chinese government. So what is interesting is that in some ways when the government intervenes, it immediately splits industrial production and residential. So this looks almost like any other city, no? So now you have residences and everything is organized, and there is a kind of nice water body, urban water body, and green, and so on and so forth. So it looks. So one of the questions is to what degree we can preserve. I mean, it's the same case as El Giro. What do you do in El Giro? I mean, it's obviously a very interesting thing what was happening there. It's something that could be empowered by new manufacturing technologies of 3D printing and so on and so forth, which do not require the same scale of infrastructure and logistics that traditional industrial production require, but maybe at the same time it's idealistic to think that vast areas of central Seoul have this kind of slum quality and density also. So another thing that happens with these projects for redeveloping the Taobao villages is that the density increases. These areas have become wealthy, so the land is more valuable, so it's not just 1 floor or 2 floor structures, but it's like 5 or 6 story high urban fabric. I don't know what is the solution, but I think it's an interesting thing to consider, to what degree we can integrate industries in the inner city, thinking that industrial policies and the retrieval of industry in cities, following Hajon Chang, but also following the trends now in politics of retrieving those urban economies are an important factor. I mean, this I think is a slide that I should have had before. This is one of these Khrushchevka's cities in the Soviet Union, Norilsk town. So these are kind of like, this is the counterpoint to the American suburb as a kind of industrial production. So it's mass produced residential fabrics. This is the distribution of Taobao villages in Zhejiang provinces. So you see that it's almost like the industry spreads out around big cities in small cores of production that become very effective, very wealthy, in fact. And these are some studies that are done. So the structure of this is a traditional Chinese rural town in which every house had a garden where they cultivated greens or kept animals, or I don't know exactly what they were doing, but I think the red are the residential units and the blue are the units that have been already converted to industry and are operating as part of this factory, this kind of micro factory. So this whole situation occurs in parallel to what has been called the maker movement, which actually starts in 2005 with the launching of a magazine called Maker that collects the interests of increasing amounts of people who are interested in the fact of making things. So if, let's say, some young graduate from the university in the 90s in, I don't know, in the US or in Europe, I don't know, here maybe also, would come out, would probably not even think about making or construction as an interesting activity, because that activity became part of the industry was sent to China, and nobody wanted to know anything about that. But it's interesting that in 2005 increasing amounts of engineering graduates and start becoming interested again in making things with new production technologies. And so there is a kind of history that starts in 2005 and maybe reaches the peak at the moment in I don't know, when was it, 2018 or 2017, when Obama literally in one of the addresses says that the only way to retrieve industry into the United States is to rely on new production technologies and wars that the state is going to start, the American government is going to start investing in the development of these technologies. May 2013 is when Obama makes this. And so what is interesting about this whole making or makers scene is that they also work in slightly different spaces. They are industrial spaces that these people, but they are not the traditional second industrial revolution rows of people specialized doing one thing. So somebody is putting this screw and the next guy is putting doing something else with the product, and it goes from one operator to another, always doing the same thing. So these people are using computers, are doing multiple tasks at the same time. They are smaller production factories, much more customized, and the type of space that these things produce are different from traditional factories. They are clean factories also. I mean, not everything can be produced here, but it's interesting that this type of labor is easily integrable into urban structures. And so if you think about Ha-Joon Chang, or if you think about Steve Bannon and Elizabeth Warren, this is an industrial form that can be easily refitted into the inner city center, and that resonates with maybe Eugeo or the Taoba villages in China. It's interesting that actually that happened mainly in Asia. That I mean, the phenomenon like Eugeo, I don't think I can't think about any place in Europe where that happened. That kind of retaining of production factories inside of the city, which even if industrial revolution happened mainly in Europe, but the factories moved away because they were toxic, and so this I mean, it's kind of images of how these people work, and compare these images with this, which is basically the origin of the industrial process. So the type of spaces and the type of organizations and the type of planning of the work. The planning is very important. We will talk about planning next in the session, but this is a kind of hierarchical structure where everybody has one function and is part of this kind of organization, and it produces an entirely different type of space from the maker's environment, where people are doing different things, etc., and the space is not organized in rows that are specialized at doing certain things. So this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This is probably already, well, this is still part of the Industrial Revolution, but then the third Industrial Revolution, as Rifkin says, integrates computers and automated work, but still the space is very, it's almost like the Khrushchevka. It's like in modernist industrial production space, which is maybe a little bit difficult to integrate in cities if we understand that cities are things that are integrating residential and and production facilities. It's kind of, I'm just showing you different or some sort of evolution of workspaces to see how these new forms of urban production are so different from these spaces, and so there are literal implications in the design of buildings. And there was something in the 60s that started in Germany called the Bürolandschaft. I don't know whether you have heard about this. So instead of using or replicating those spaces of industrial production, the Bürolandschaft people started thinking that the work had to be more varied, and that in some ways they were acknowledging that they had moved from the second industrial revolution to the third industrial revolution in the space, and so the work was much less homogeneous and regimented, and the interior spaces of the buildings was also changing. So these are some of the plans of this. I mean, these plans are different from the Bürolandschaft, no, because the makers require some closed rooms that contain robots or 3D printers or things like that. So this is how, but it's deep space. So, and it is interesting that that kind of slightly more complex organization of workspaces is what Facebook does. I mean, this is the Frank Gehry headquarters for Facebook, and look how much does it look like. I mean, it's like the opposite, perhaps, of what an industrial production space looks like. It is interesting that also these type of people, and now we are talking about the makers scene as maybe the forefront of some potential reintegration of industrial labor into the fabric of the city, and the shifting economy from a service and real estate economy back to a at least partially industrial economy. Many of these makers have taken over former industrial buildings. This one is in London. This is a project actually in in London of a district that is targeting this type of young makers, etc. And it's very interesting to see what people put in there, because it's the kind of organic food, some sort of new urban life that is connected. I mean, it's not just the industrial production, it's a whole lifestyle that is being created in the inner city center, where again living and producing happens together, where there is some kind of reappreciation for vegetables and organic food. Somebody was talking about bees, so that's also some of the things that are happening in these new districts. Urban farming comes together with this trend, so it's a whole set of new urban lifestyles that are being brought by this reintegration of urban production into the city. And look at this guy. This is a typical, how do they call them? The hipsters. So this is a typical American hipster with a beard and kind of maybe growing his own food and producing things with a 3D printer in the backyard, and so on and so forth. And so this is a little bit of a joke, but when I saw this picture, it immediately reminded me of something, and that kind of launched another interesting set of urban phenomena that have to do with this reintegration of urban work in the city. How much does he reminds this guy, who is William Morris? And so then I thought, well, this hipsters guys looks like William Morris. And so it so happens that William Morris and the whole arts and crafts movement in England is a very interesting historical precedent for all this, because if you think about what the industrial production, the planning of industrial production and the industrial production of the city, which we saw in the American suburb and we saw in the Khrushchevkas, so the modernist city of segregated functions in different parts of the city, also segregated design and production. So there were people who were engineers, there were people who were designers, there were people who were planning the way things were going to happen, and there were people who were producing, and they were totally separate in the modernist. That's the kind of inheritance of the second industrial revolution, but it's the idea that there are people who think and people who do, and they are two separate things, and the people who do are normally dumb. They don't need to think. But what happens both with the arts and crafts and with the hipsters is that design and production come back together. So design and production are no longer different moments of some sort of specialized thing, but you are making and you are touching things and you are making physical, you have some sort of physical engagement at the same time as you are thinking. That is also something that happened with architecture. I mean, architecture became a gentleman's profession where we are conceiving things and we don't really have a clue of how they are getting built. I mean, that's one of the problems that, you know, the schools of architecture have produced in the last 2 decades, that we have created a whole group of people who are no longer trusted to do anything because they don't have a clue of how things get built. So there is some sort of deliberate division, but which is part of the modernist ethos, that I think is going to be challenged. It's going to be challenged when we think again about reintroducing industrial production in cities. That was, the critique of William Morris. William Morris was basically the whole arts and crafts in England was a critique to Taylorism. So Taylorism, industrial production, had specialized work, had removed intelligence from anything physical. And what Morris said when he went to see the exhibition in 1898, the famous glass palace exhibition, was that industrial production was poor. Like the objects were rough. They didn't have intelligence. They had been almost like they didn't have soul. That was and so the arts and crafts people started thinking that in order to retrieve the soul of products, of artifacts, they needed to bring back intelligence and craft into the production of objects. And so it is interesting that this is the famous Red House from William Morris, and the whole, even socially speaking, I can't remember what was let me see if I can. No, it wasn't this slide, but there is a famous statement. I'll find it later on, from Orwell criticizing the arts and crafts. That is almost as if he's talking about the hipsters. So what is interesting about this arts and crafts situation is that they bring back the unity of, and there is a number of other people. Owen Jones actually makes cities, and so there is also planning that is related to I found the citation. George Orwell at some point he didn't like he was a modernist, so he didn't like the arts and crafts guys who were promoting the kind of return to the nature, and they were also part of the Garden City movement, and she says, every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, sex maniac, Quaker, nature cure, quack, pacifist, and feminist in England are part of the arts and crafts people. So he basically looked at people like Morris, Bernard, people who were thinking about moving out of the city into the countryside to live a healthy lifestyle, and they were kind of famously doing orgies and all kinds of liberal sexual practices were part of these kind of arts and crafts. So I don't know what that means, but I think that the arts and crafts is a very interesting precedent to this kind of return of nature and industrial production back into the city. This guy is Friedrich Hayek. You may have heard about him. He's a very famous economist, one of the people who emerged from the Viennese ultra-liberal economic school. And we mentioned him before because he was a student of Schumpeter, who was a student of Kondratiev. He is the guy who made something that was called the Mont Pelerin Society, that included people like Karl Popper and Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman is, as you may know, also an ultra-liberal economist who basically said that the state should disappear from any processes, and everything has to be self-regulated. So what Hayek wrote a book that is now often cited amongst the kind of right-wing, American right-wing, which is called the Road to Serfdom, in which he basically criticized the Soviet and Chinese political system as systems that plan everything. So there are quinquennial plans, and there are every 5 years the government decides the policies for the next 5 years, and everything is organized, and they produce the Khrushchevkas, and so the city, the economy, everything is planned to detail. Everything is decided beforehand, and is again the kind of maximum paradigm of the division between the designers or the policy makers and the people who implement policy. And that obviously had the result in the making of the city that we saw with the Khrushchevkas. So the city made as some sort of mass-produced fabric. So Hayek promoted self-reliance and non-planning. So he basically said that the state should disappear. I mean, it's like a kind of ultra-liberal idea that then informed the mind of Milton Friedman, that, as you may know, is the kind of economist of Margaret Thatcher and the kind of ultra-liberal. So these people were fundamentally against any form of planning. And in some ways, I mean, he was not a maker, he was not related to these things that we are doing, but the idea that you do as you go and you decide as you actually have to make something, instead of deciding everything a priori and then, so planning everything a priori by experts and then letting that happen by other people who don't need to think, they just do operations in an industrial chain, was very much part of this idea also of self-reliance, which is self-reliance is very important for the whole maker ecology. Like the fact that you don't need to rely on things, you do it yourself. You solve problems, you think as you go. There is no final ideal state, but things keep evolving. So think about what does this mean in terms of planning cities or planning buildings or designing as a kind of almost theoretical enterprise as opposed to something that is related to making the building. So these are, different comics. It is a very important book, The Road to Serfdom, that I think you should look at, because it's almost like now it's a very, very current debate, this question on whether we rely on the state or and then the state is necessary or not. I mean, this is a kind of deep political discussion. This is the city that Hayek was reacting against, the industrial planned city, and think about how much does this relate also to the workspaces. And there is a number of people that emerge in the field of architecture and urban design in parallel to the emergence of the Montpellierin Society and the Viennese School of Economics, which are people like Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs was famously opposing, what was the name of the famous mayor of New York who built basically the whole, my memory is like going by the day. Anyway, you can look at it. So Jane Jacobs was reacting to this idea that you plan brutally over the city, you don't care about what the communities are, etc. I mean, she has a slightly different take because it's a much more community-based approach. But you can say that Jane Jacobs was reacting to what was happening in the Soviet Union also. So the Soviet Union was the enemy. Communism was the ultimately planned economy, and all these people, Hayek and the whole Viennese school, were reacting against communism and planning and the radical division between design and making. And so this kind of, I think this is East Berlin, the picture, and they were showing what was the city before and what was the city after planning, no? And there's a number of people, Robert Goodman, Jane Jacobs, the Death and Life of Great American Cities after the planners, that create a whole trend of urban theory around the idea of non-planning. So if the industrial production of the city was the ultimate stage of division, these people were saying, no, what we need to do is not to plan the cities. Every time that we plan the cities, we kill them. And so that was collected by, or was influenced a whole generation of artists and thinkers, amongst them people like Cedric Price or Peter Hall in England, or Rainer Banham, who were fascinated by the idea of non-planning and the city that is kind of produced ad hoc. Probably Rainer Banham, the architecture of, they were fascinated by Los Angeles because everything was a mess, everything was out of control, people were driving everywhere and there was no order. And so to these people who were against the planned economies and the planned societies and the division between thinking and making, there is in the 70s a whole trend that again grow under the umbrella, let's say, of Hayek's and Montpellierin Society economic theory that was very productive in the architectural scene, and that, I mean, like Colin Rowe, collage city, the city that is not homogeneous but is made out of fragments that are brought from different ages and is more interesting. It's resonates with postmodernism in some ways, and then there is Claude Lévi-Strauss, The Savage Mind. I don't know whether you have this, you know this book, but it's also a crucial book written by Claude Lévi-Strauss, a structuralist anthropologist, French structuralist anthropologist, who talks about the mind of the savage as a different mind from the civilized, or theoretically civilized people, but nevertheless an interesting mind that he associates to the bricoleur. The bricoleur is like doing bricolage. Is the French for bricolage is a French word, but is somebody who is not designing beforehand, but is kind of hanging around, picking up things and putting them together somehow in order to do a project. So it is the savage man in a way is very much is cited by Colin Rowe and Fred Coeter in Collage City, is the guy who, or the guys who, the girls that think about the city as a collection of inconsistent things. I forgot to mention, I think it's somewhere there, you know, one of the guys who one of the people that were close to this scene of the new society and the non-planning were Allison and Peter Smithson. And Allison and Peter Smithson famously said they were promoting what was called the as found. So they thought that you need to work with what you find, thinking about this kind of bricolage way of thinking in making the city, and they literally said that for them design is a dirty word. That's a literal quotation of Allison and Peter Smithson. Design is a dirty word. They were against design. They were in favor of putting reality together with what they found, the as found. So this Hayek himself had mentioned what he called the unscientific knowledge. So there is no science, there is no expertise of the city. So we should kind of do as we go. I'm not saying this is right. Okay, so I'm also skeptical about these things. But I think it's a very interesting dichotomy to think about and to position ourselves in when thinking about planning cities and so on and so forth. So the savage mind, the bricoleur. Think about how much of this is also embedded into the arts and crafts movement. So let's move on. These are kind of more recent forms of this type of approach to making and designing. Charles Jenks and Nathan Silver famously published this book. Let me see if I find the date, but this is 1973. They made a book that was called Acothism, and you see this kind of savage mind, this kind of as found, non-design, non-planned way of assembling objects and designing things. I mean, Achille Castiglione probably, and Arte Povera would be probably good aesthetic synthesis of what many people were thinking in parallel to all these architects, Rainer Banham, Smithsons, etc. In terms of how do we think about cities and how do we make things at the same time. So I think maybe this session is doing both things at the same time. We are thinking about how to make the city and how the city incorporates the making. And Joseph Grima in 2012, Adhocracy, same idea, but obviously Joseph Grima is already talking about the maker scene. He's talking about new forms of production and how these new forms of production are again bringing together making and thinking, and not long-term planning, not large, not self-reliance, not reliance on large organizations or structures. So things like this come to mind: Grammatio and color, the robotic touch, the fact that we can use these digital making technologies to design things that and to build things that probably we couldn't build literally before, because they were too late. I mean, we could build them, but at an incredible cost. Philip Yuan in Shanghai also playing with the materials and with robots as mechanisms that enable to vary and to do. I mean, the emergence of also digital technologies as literal building devices that enable us to do full-scale 3D printing. This is something that is emerging. It's not yet very extended, but is possible, and obviously gives us new possibilities. It's interesting how also some of these construction mechanisms are using clay and are using cellulose, like natural products to build these things, and wood. So there is again a kind of tendency to use materials that are not synthetic, etc., and I mean these are maybe the latest tendencies that I want to talk today about, as maybe things that designers could exploit in the future. And so I would like to finish with this project, which is an installation by Grammatio and Color. I don't know whether you know these things, but Grammatio, one of the things that I think is more interesting about what they are doing now is this, which is they are using the robots not just to put bricks in a certain location in space, using the fact that the robot can actually do that easily and cheaply, but they are starting to look at construction systems that first the robot measures the form of the material. So instead of using a piece of wood that has been cut with a saw and is like a regularized piece of wood, they are working on mechanisms that can sense the form of a stone and place it in the exact location where it will stick. Maybe this is a slightly different thing, but it's some sort of micro collage, micro adhocracy. So it's ad hoc and is using digital technologies in order to produce things with objects that are found, as the Smithsons used to say. So the design is assembled by the robot sensing objects and geometries of objects that are maybe rubble or debris, and is able to think where to locate that piece in this construction. It's a kind of automated recycling of debris. They are working with rubble, with basically demolition material. So you take pieces of an existing building that are broken, have an irregular shape, and the robot is able to think where to put that piece so that it would be a stable structure. And so I just wanted to finish with those images from. I mean, this is a kind of theoretical installation. Is not really a real construction, but the fact that machines have the capacity to also sense the form and bring the form automatically into a design, I think is maybe the edge of this non-human adhocracy, if we think about the content of this whole seminar. So that's, I think, the last image.